The wind howled from the north, sweeping through the cracks of the doors and carrying with it flurries of white snow, covering the earth and sky with a thick blanket of snow. The dark clouds churned, descending as if they were going to swallow the vast and endless land of Montana. Winter had arrived, and with it, the unpredictable snowstorms that brought not only cold and harshness to humans, but also to all creatures in this land. John, the elderly cattle rancher, sat in his old wooden house, his tired eyes gazing out the window. The house was silent, empty, with cracks on the walls and unavoidable gaps that allowed the cold wind to rush in, like an endless loneliness. After the death of Anna, his wife, the house was now left with only John and his thick memories. He sighed, feeling loneliness consume his soul. Life used to be filled with the laughter of his wife and children, but now it was only the sound of the wind, the crackling of firewood in the stove. The kitchen door creaked as he entered, his weathered hands, fingers worn from years of ranching, gripping the porcelain cup in his hand. The black coffee, bitter and warm, seemed to be the only thing that gave him some comfort amidst the harshness of winter. Suddenly, a faint noise outside startled John. It was a sound unlike what he usually heard, not the sound of branches tapping the window or the noise of cattle in the pen. A faint whimper. He placed the cup down, stood up, his stiff legs carrying him outside. The sun had long set, leaving only a faint glow from the gray clouds in the sky, signaling that a fierce snowstorm was approaching. Stepping out onto the porch, John paused for a moment to adjust his vision. His eyes scanned the thick snowstorm while strong winds blew against his face. His mind ached as he thought of the animals he needed to care for that night. Suddenly, the whimpering sound grew louder, weak and full of despair, making his heart tighten. He put all his strength into each step as he trudged through the snowstorm, with nothing to guide him but the instincts of someone who had lived in this land for many years. The whimpering grew louder, leading him toward the edge of the forest near the farm. And then, under the thick blanket of snow, he discovered something he hadn't expected. A litter of wolf cubs, about 8, huddled in the snow. Their eyes were wide, filled with fear and weakness, with no mother in sight. They were trying to hide under the snow, shivering uncontrollably from the unbearable cold. John didn't know what to do, but when he saw them, he felt something he had never felt before, a strong impulse, as though he had realized that he had a responsibility for these tiny lives. There was no time to think. John quickly removed his thick coat and wrapped the wolf cubs in it. They didn't resist, only weakly whimpering, their shining eyes looking up at him as if hoping for a miracle. The biting cold of the snow seeped into John's skin, but he didn't care. The warmth from the tiny creatures trembling in his arms made the cold of winter seem unimportant. At that moment, a strong gust of wind blew through, forcing John to stop and steady himself. The snow began to fall thicker, and it became harder to distinguish the surrounding objects. Still, he continued walking, holding the wolf cubs tightly in his arms, his heart filled with both anxiety and determination. Surely something was happening, and he couldn't leave them here. Entering the house, he placed the wolf cubs near the stove. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, and inside the warm room, the cubs began to stir. They were still too weak to care for themselves, but the warmth from the fire made them feel safer. The warmth from the fire seemed like a miracle to them, wild creatures facing the bitter cold of winter. John looked into their eyes, still filled with fear, his lips silently whispering a promise. "I won't abandon you." Though unsure of what to do next, one thing was clear. John would not turn back and leave them. He pulled the old wooden chair closer to the cubs, sat down, and began planning how to care for them. Throughout his life, John had never faced a challenge like this. But he knew that, no matter how difficult the journey, saving these wolf cubs was something he had to do. John sat by the stove, his eyes fixed on the wolf cubs huddled under warm blankets. In the air filled with the howling wind and snow outside the window, the warmth of the small house was all they could feel at that moment. The cubs had not yet calmed down from the cold. They nestled together, their eyes still filled with fear. But gradually, after a few hours, exhaustion made them drift into a deep sleep, and John could feel a strange sense of peace in the living, vibrant space of this dark night. While the cubs lay still, John sat quietly beside the fire, his gnarled hands gently turning the coffee cup in his hands. Yet his gaze never left the wolf cubs, as if he was seeing in them a different life, a wild life now under threat. A sense of emptiness in his heart made John think about their mother. Surely something had happened, some kind of tragedy, because by instinct, a wolf mother never abandons her cubs, especially in a snowstorm like this. Could it be the mother wolf had died? This thought kept swirling in John's mind, like a knife cutting through his heart. Even when he tried to shake it off, the image of the wolf mother appeared in his mind. A strong, instinctive, brave, and loving creature. How could he accept so easily that such a being would leave her cubs in this harsh winter? The next day, after feeding the cubs, checking their health, and cleaning around the house, John decided to go outside. The storm had passed, but the snow still kept falling, covering the ground and forming a thick blanket of snow, making everything seem hazy and difficult to recognize. However, John, with his years of experience in this land, could still spot traces on the ground, even though they were partially covered by the snow. He walked through the forest area near the farm, where he had found the cubs. His eyes lit up when he saw a wide trail of blood staining the snow, leading down a path he had never seen before. John's heart began to race, a vague sense of anxiety rising in him. He walked closer, eyes scanning, and then a scene made his heart tighten. The lifeless body of an adult wolf, lying motionless on the ground, eyes wide open, jaws clenched as if it had fought until its last breath. The body was covered in wounds, seemingly with no chance of survival. John approached, crouched down, and his hand trembled as he touched the cold body of the mother wolf. The wounds on its body showed signs of a fierce battle. Perhaps the mother wolf had fought against some greater predator, or perhaps simply struggled between life and death in the snowstorm. But whatever the case, its sacrifice was undeniable. It had protected its cubs wonderfully, until it had no strength left. A wave of pain and sorrow overwhelmed John as he knelt beside the wolf's body, eyes brimming with tears. A sense of loss surged in his heart, but he knew he had not been wrong in seeing the cubs in his house. The mother wolf had sacrificed herself, not because she didn't love them, but because her love was so great. She protected them, even in the most desperate of circumstances. In John's heart at that moment, deep empathy and respect for that powerful creature surged. It had done what a loving mother would do, protected her children to the last breath. John stood up, his eyes still fixed on the mother wolf's body. The stillness of the surrounding landscape made the moment even more special, as if the world was left with only him and the wolf, sharing an unspoken bond between life and death. The cold wind swept through the forest, but it could not dispel the heavy sadness in his heart. He turned back, looking toward the wolf cubs lying peacefully in the house. Now, in his mind, there was no doubt anymore. The mother wolf had passed, but her legacy lived on in these tiny creatures that needed him to protect them. The cubs would not have to face loneliness, for he would be the one to replace their mother, helping them grow strong and resilient. A heavy sense of responsibility weighed on John's shoulders, but he also realized there was no other way. The mother wolf had sacrificed herself for her cubs, and now he had to continue the journey she had started. John walked toward the house, determined not to let the cubs suffer or lack anything. The mother wolf had done all she could to protect them. Now he would do everything he could to care for and nurture them, so that when the time came, they could go free, strong, and mature, just as their mother had wanted. The early days of caring for the wolf cubs passed in constant busyness and worry. John knew that keeping them alive was not a simple task. All day long, he had to take turns caring for them, from feeding to keeping them warm, from comforting words to tender gazes. Each wolf cub had its own unique traits, and John quickly realized that they were not wild creatures easily tamed. But he also felt clearly that these creatures, though weak, contained a powerful life force that not everyone could understand. The first meal for the wolf cubs was a challenge. They refused to drink the milk immediately, their eyes full of confusion, as if not knowing what to do with the liquid he offered. Their tiny tongues fluttered in the air, and some of the cubs wagged their tails, showing no interest in the smell of the milk. John did not rush. He placed a small bowl near them, gently petting each cub, hoping that his patience would help them understand that this was necessary for survival. Day after day, John continued this routine. Every day, he brought warm milk to them, patiently coaxing each one. One day, one of them, the smallest cub with dark gray fur and a misty pattern like fog, seemed to understand and began licking the milk from the bowl. John smiled, his eyes lighting up with joy as he saw this little cub begin to eat. This felt like a sign that everything would be all right. And indeed, when the smallest cub started eating, the others followed. A habit gradually formed in the pack, and feeding them became an important part of John's daily life. Along with feeding, keeping the cubs warm was another significant challenge, especially at night when the temperature outside dropped below freezing, and John's wooden house, though cozy, was not enough to hold off all the cold. John used old blankets and bedding from his family's past, folding them in a small warm nest for the cubs. Under the flickering light of the fire in the stove, he gently placed each cub into its spot, hugging them close if necessary to keep them from the biting cold. Whenever they nestled together, wagging their tails, that was when John felt a sense of peace in his heart. As the wolf cubs began to grow, John saw clear changes in them. Their small legs began to develop, their soft, smooth fur slowly becoming thicker and sturdier. At first, they only knew how to curl up in warm spots, but soon these little wolves began to get curious about the world around them. One day, when John opened the door to bring food to the cubs, he was surprised to find that they were no longer huddled in the corner of the room, but had ventured outside, running around the house. Their steps were still clumsy, but they were no longer as weak as before. John began teaching them some simple skills. He threw small pieces of meat to them and saw them run after it, using their tender jaws to snap it up. This simple action was a sign of maturity. The wolf cubs, now, were no longer just creatures dependent on humans. They had started to learn how to be independent and tap into their instincts. These days, for John, were filled with both excitement and sadness. He knew that taking care of the cubs wasn't just about the present, but a nurturing process to help them grow and return to the wild. There were moments, as he watched the cubs play outside, when John felt a vague sadness. The cubs were no longer the weak creatures that knew nothing, but had become beings capable of survival. One day, when they were strong enough, they would have to leave and return to nature. John had prepared himself mentally for this, but his heart didn't easily accept it. With the help of Lily, who came to learn and exchange experiences about caring for wildlife, John gained a better understanding of what the cubs needed. Lily brought them specialized tools, lessons on teaching the cubs to hunt and how to integrate into the wild world. She taught John how to recognize the subtle signs in the cubs' behavior to determine whether they were healthy or stressed. Lily also brought John books about wild animals, helping him understand more about the instincts of wolves and the necessary habits to raise them properly. Under Lily's guidance, John began teaching the cubs the survival skills they needed. He took them into the forest, where nature would be the greatest teacher. Their first steps on the forest ground were unsteady, but quickly, they learned how to recognize directions, sense smells, and hear sounds around them. These lessons were not only to help the cubs survive, but also to remind them that their instincts would always guide them. In just a short time, the once tiny wolf cubs had transformed into strong, agile creatures with bright eyes and thick, sturdy fur. They no longer hesitated when facing challenges. Chasing, jumping, and struggling had become an essential part of their lives. And John, though he couldn't do much other than watch and guide them, felt his heart lighten. The days of caring for the cubs made John realize that, despite the difficulties and challenges, life could change with just a simple act of kindness, with one right decision. The wolf cubs had not only grown, but they had changed his life. These wild creatures not only needed protection, but also love and a deep understanding of their nature. And in this journey, John had learned a valuable lesson about patience, love, and responsibility. Spring arrived with its warm rays gradually melting away the remnants of the cold winter. The surrounding landscape was filled with new life. Trees began to sprout, and even the wild animals seemed to sense this change. For John, this was an important time to reflect on his journey with the wolf cubs. But it was also during these months, as everything began returning to normal, that something he never anticipated began to form. Friendship, a bond between a man who had lost his loved ones and the wolf cubs, wild creatures he had saved. At first, when the wolf cubs grew and became able to care for themselves, John thought his mission was complete. These creatures had grown stronger, and it was time for them to return to the wild. But the bond between him and the cubs grew deeper and harder to sever. John couldn't deny that, even though they were wild creatures, the cubs had brought him a feeling he had never experienced before: true companionship. One morning, as John went outside to check the pens and his other animals, he realized something very special. Even though the cubs no longer needed direct care from him, they still often lingered around him whenever he went outside. They were no longer as fearful as they had been at the beginning. Instead, they were curious and friendly. One of them, the gray cub that John had particularly noticed from the start, now almost never left his side. Whenever John paused to do something, the cub would sit nearby, its bright yellow eyes fixed on him, as if it were saying, "I'm here, I'm always here." John could feel the change within himself. The wolves were no longer just wild creatures he had saved. They had become a part of his life. They were not just animals, but began to show intelligence and sharpness. Whenever he went outside, they followed him like loyal companions, always accompanying him, always monitoring every step, as if they understood that he was the one who cared for them, and they would protect him if necessary. This friendship was not only coming from John, but also from the wolf cubs. As they grew, they clearly expressed their attachment and concern for him. The wolves no longer just followed him when he went out to work. They also began showing clear protective actions. One time, while John was walking into the forest to check the land around the farm, he suddenly encountered an adult wolf from another pack. This animal appeared strong and aggressive, perhaps trying to invade the territory of the wolves John had been caring for. In that situation, when John stood facing the large wolf, his cubs, without hesitation, rushed out from the forest behind. Although they were still very young and lacked the strength to confront the adult wolf directly, They stood firmly beside John, showing their determination to protect him. Their low growls, sharp eyes full of vigilance, made the adult wolf realize that this was not an area easily infiltrated. The cubs would never allow anyone to harm the man who had saved them. In the end, the adult wolf retreated, unwilling to attack any further. John stood there, his heart filled with surprise and emotion. These cubs did not just see him as their caretaker, but as part of their life. This, to John, was the noblest symbol of friendship. These wild creatures were no longer just animals he had saved, but had become true friends, loyal comrades, beings tied to him not just in life, but throughout their long journey together. The relationship between John and the wolf pack gradually shifted from protection and care to a strong, cooperative bond. The wolves were no longer merely animals that needed care. They had become true friends, loyal companions in all of John's work. Every morning when John went outside to tend to the farm, the cubs would follow him, their bright eyes and agile bodies exploring the world around them. The sound of their excited howls, long yawns, and wagging tails when John turned to look at them. All of these moments had become an indispensable part of his life. But this friendship was not one-sided. John realized that, over the course of caring for the cubs, he had gradually changed. He was no longer a lonely man, tormented by the pain of loss. The cubs, with their loyalty and strength, had helped him regain his resilience in life. Each passing day, John felt like he was coming back to life, with a new purpose and renewed energy. The wolf cubs not only helped him heal the pain of losing his wife, but they also brought him a new family, a friendship he had never imagined having in his life. These moments, these simple times when he stood beside the cubs, taught John about patience, courage, and unconditional love. These wild creatures, though seeming cold and distant, held a deep affection, and in John's case, this friendship became stronger than ever. It was not just an exchange between a man and the cubs, but a profound spiritual connection that transcended the boundaries between animals and humans. The friendship between John and the wolf pack was not just a simple relationship, but a lasting one, built on understanding, protection, and loyalty. It proved that sometimes in this world, friendship can come from unexpected places, from wild creatures that we never imagined could become true friends. The sun began to rise, casting weak rays of light through the thick gray clouds, signaling the end of a long winter. The fresh and chilly air of spring filled the space, evoking a sense of renewal, as if everything were waking up from a long sleep. But for John, today was not just any ordinary day. Today, he would have to do what he had known was necessary for a long time, but never easy: releasing the wolf cubs back into the wild. His heart was heavy as he thought about this moment. The cubs were no longer the fragile creatures he had saved during that snowstorm years ago. They were now strong, agile, and more confident than ever. Each wolf was capable of hunting, protecting itself, and most importantly, they had found independence. John knew that this was the time for them to return to nature, where they belonged, but inside him, a deep sorrow rose. The creatures he had cared for, loved, and accompanied for such a long time were now going to leave him. John stood by the window, looking outside, where the wolf cubs were playing in the small yard near the house. Their swift steps and joyful howls filled the air. They no longer feared their companions. The larger, grown wolves, with their bright eyes and thick fur, had become true warriors. But it was these moments when they played together, when they looked at him with affectionate eyes, that made his heart tighten. It was the image of a family he had helped create, and now he had to let them go to find their own path. The preparations for releasing the wolves had been made days earlier. John had found an area far from the farm, a safe place away from human settlements. A pristine land with majestic mountains and dense forests, where the wolves could live freely and thrive. This was where they truly belonged. To ensure they wouldn't face immediate danger, John had prepared a detailed plan. He would lead the wolves into this area, help them get accustomed to the new environment before fully separating and letting them go free. When everything was ready, John stepped outside, carrying small wooden crates with food and water for the wolves. When the wolves saw him, they didn't rush to him, but instead watched him with deep, understanding eyes, as if they knew something was about to happen. John felt their gaze, and in that moment, an emotional wave rose within him. The wolves, though grown strong, still saw him as their protector, as the father who had cared for them. This made his heart ache, even though he knew this was the time for them to become independent. He opened the door and stepped outside. The wolf cubs followed him, walking slowly, their strong steps on the moist spring ground. The joyful howls, the tail wagging, filled the air with life. But in each wolf's eyes, John saw unfamiliarity. They had never ventured far from the farm, where they had been born and raised. But today, they were no longer weak creatures. They now had the strength to face any challenge. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the sound of the wolves' footsteps became more unfamiliar. The cubs stopped looking around. This was the first time they had truly entered an entirely different world, a place without warm bowls of milk or cozy nests in the house. John said nothing, just continued to lead them forward. Gradually, they began to follow him, no longer hesitating. Their steps grew stronger, their long yawns after a long, cold night of sleep now faded, ready to live in the wild. After a while, John stopped. He pointed to a vast area ahead, where a green meadow and distant mountain ranges lay. This was where the wolves would begin their new life. This was where they would use all the skills he had helped them learn. The wolves stopped, looked around, and then turned to look back at John. Their eyes lit up, as if they understood that they had reached the place they needed to be. There were no farewells, no calls, just silence, a silence full of meaning. John stood there, watching the wolf cubs. He saw them turn to look at him one last time before gently stepping into the forest, blending with nature. They had begun their new life, and John knew it was time to let them go. He stood still, his hands clenched tightly, trying not to let the tears fall. But deep in his heart, he felt a sense of pride. These wolves, now strong and grown, no longer needed him, but they would never forget him, just as he would never forget them. When the wolves disappeared behind the trees, John turned and walked away. His steps were slow, but filled with peace. Though his heart was heavy, he knew he had done the right thing. The wolves would continue their lives, free and full of challenges. And John, with his heart full of memories, knew that he had given them the opportunity to live, the opportunity their mother had sacrificed her life to protect. This was the end of one chapter in his life, but it was also the beginning of a new journey for the wolves. As he returned home, there were no wolf cubs running after him, no presence of them by his side, but in his heart, their image would always remain vivid. A new chapter had begun, and John, though in solitude, understood that the cubs would live strong, as their mother had wished, and as he had helped them grow. John stood by the window, his eyes gazing at the clear sky of a spring morning. The warm sunbeams pierced through the dense foliage, casting light on the ground where his wolf cubs were happily running and playing. The sight before him filled his heart with an indescribable joy, a sense of completeness he had never experienced before. The wolves, now more mature, stronger, and no longer the fragile creatures he had saved in the freezing cold of that winter, were running freely. Though they no longer depended on him as they once did, They still returned to seek his companionship. Their hasty footsteps, the high leaps over tree roots, and the short, joyful howls filled the air around John with life and hope. Every morning, when he stepped outside, the wolf cubs greeted him with their lively cries, as if they were saying, "We're still here. We're still by your side." John had once thought that after releasing them back to nature, he would no longer be important in their lives. But the reality was different. The cubs didn't turn away, didn't abandon him as wild creatures often would. Instead, they sought him out as a friend, a mentor, an irreplaceable companion on their journey. And in those moments, when he saw them running towards him, John felt a surge of emotion he had never known. It was a simple but profound joy, the joy of someone who had given so much but also received boundless, unconditional affection in return. The wolf cubs had begun to show their independence. They could hunt, find their own food, and even help each other in the search for sustenance. John noticed the changes in them. The cubs he had raised, nurtured from the beginning, were now not just physically grown, but mentally stronger. They had learned to care for each other, to protect one another, and most importantly, they had learned how to survive in the wild without human assistance. One day, as John was walking with the cubs in the forest around the farm, he suddenly noticed something strange. One of the cubs, the smallest of the pack, was staying close to him and didn't wander off like the others usually did. It didn't seem anxious or shy, but instead displayed clear confidence. Yet in its eyes, there remained a deep bond with him. Near a small hill, the cub suddenly stopped, looked at him, then glanced around. It seemed to have made a decision. John, without speaking, simply stood there, looking at it with understanding, as if he could feel the transition, the change that words could not describe. The cub looked at him one last time, then ran into the forest, joining the world it was born to belong to. That moment, though simple, was a significant milestone in John's journey with the wolf cubs. He understood that even though he had returned them to nature, the bond between humans and these creatures was not just about rescue or protection, but about sharing a deep understanding between different species. John watched the small wolf's silhouette disappear into the forest, pride swelling in his chest. This was what he had hoped for them, to live freely, to mature in the wild environment they belonged to. As each day passed, the cubs grew stronger and more confident. Though they no longer depended on John in their separation, he felt a deep connection, a true joy. The wolves were not just animals he had saved, but powerful, independent creatures ready to face the challenging natural world. John was no longer the only one caring for them, but he was the one who had given them the best start, allowing them to live the way they should. Every time the cubs ran around him in the early mornings, when their joyful howls echoed, or when they returned to him to share a little affection in those simple moments, John felt as if he were living again. He was no longer lonely, and this made him realize that sometimes true joy doesn't come from material things or life achievements, but from the simplest connections, from relationships that are unspoken, but deeper than anything else. John looked at the now mature cubs, who had become wild warriors, and a flood of joy filled his heart. This was joy not from the fact that they still needed him, but from the realization that they could now overcome every challenge nature threw at them on their own. And deep in his heart, he understood that the greatest joy he could give the cubs was freedom, the strong life in their natural environment. Their strong steps, their joyful howls were not just signs of growth, but proof of giving and receiving, of sharing that words could never fully express. John stood still, listening to the wolves' howls carried by the wind, his heart light and filled with pride. He knew that no matter how far apart they were, no matter how many challenges lay ahead, the bond between him and the wolf cubs would always remain. It was a joy without boundaries, a joy that could never be replaced. After the wolf cubs had gradually grown and become free in the wild, John began to realize a significant change in his life. Even though the wolves were no longer by his side every day, their absence did not make his wooden house feel quiet or lonely. On the contrary, he felt his heart filled with an indescribable joy and peace. The days spent caring for the cubs had become cherished memories, and they had helped him overcome the pain and loneliness following the death of his wife. The footprints of the wolves, their joyful howls, and their occasional returns to seek his companionship had opened a new chapter in John's life. Gradually, the story of the wolf cubs spread throughout the region. At first, only John's neighbors and old friends knew about the journey he had gone through. But soon, from conversations at the small village cafe, stories about the cubs began to be told. The villagers, those who had lived near John's farm, started asking him about the wolves, about how he had saved them, the love he had for them, and what he had done to help them grow. John no longer kept this story to himself. Whenever someone came to visit, he would tell them about the challenging yet loving journey he had gone through with the wolf cubs. He spoke of the first day he found them, the worry and doubt he had when deciding to bring them home and care for them, and the growth of the cubs under his gentle care. He spoke of the unspoken bond shared between him and the cubs and the joy he felt when he saw them become strong, confident creatures, finally achieving the freedom they deserved. John's story began to attract attention from the villagers and beyond. One morning, a group of local students visited John's farm for a tour and to hear him tell the story of the cubs. They were curious children, their eyes shining bright as they listened to him speak about the wolves, how they survived and grew up in love and patience. John not only spoke of the challenges in caring for the cubs, but also shared the lessons he had learned from the journey: patience, unconditional love, and resilience. He emphasized that life is not always easy, but if we care for and treat one another with sincere hearts, wonderful things will happen. John's story quickly became an inspiration for all who heard it. The children returned to school with his story, telling their friends and teachers. The adults in the village began sharing John's story at community meetings, and gradually, the tale of the friendship between man and the wolves spread throughout the region. The wolves were not just wild creatures. They became a symbol of perseverance, compassion, and the connection between humans and nature. John's story had become a spark, igniting people's interest in wildlife conservation and making them realize that sometimes love transcends all boundaries, whether between species or between humans and animals. The story didn't stop there. It made a strong impression on animal rights activists and environmental organizations. A major wildlife protection organization came to meet John to discuss the possibility of sharing his story in animal protection campaigns. They wanted the story of the wolf cubs to be brought to a wider audience so that not just the local community, but the entire world could learn about it. John, though accustomed to quiet and simple living, never imagined his story would garner so much attention. But he realized that if sharing his story could help the efforts in animal protection, he was willing to do so. The story of the wolves was not just shared through storytelling, but also through articles and documentary videos. Lectures and community meetings followed continuously. And in each of those meetings, John was not only a storyteller, but also an inspiration. He became someone people turned to when they needed a role model for perseverance, love for nature, and compassion for animals. Questions about how to care for wildlife, the conditions they need, and how we can help them began to be asked more and more. Each time he answered those questions, John felt as if he were continuing the work he had started long ago, nurturing and protecting life, whether human or animal. From a simple story about a shepherd saving a group of wolf cubs in a snowstorm, John's tale had become a powerful spreading story of love, care, and the connection between humans and nature. Everyone who heard the story carried a deep impression, and gradually, values like compassion, wildlife protection, and responsibility toward nature became part of the community's thinking. Children, adults, and animal protectors alike all learned from John's story that we not only exist in this world, but we also have a responsibility to all the creatures around us. And when autumn came, John stood once again by the window, looking out at the forest where the wolf cubs had once freely played. This time he didn't feel lonely. In his heart, the story of the wolves would live on forever. Not only because the creatures had passed through his life, but because their story had spread to everyone. It was the boundless joy he could give, and it was also the joy he received back from this vast world. John stood alone in the open field outside the farm, his eyes gazing into the distance where the wolves had freely integrated into nature. Yet within his heart, there remained an emptiness that could not be filled. Fall had arrived, bringing with it chilly winds, but it wasn't the weather that made him shiver. It was the loneliness that had stretched on for too long. The feeling of being left behind, now that the wolf cubs had matured and no longer depended on him, seemed to make everything around him fade into dullness. He had done all he could, fulfilled his duty to the wolves, and now he had to find a way to stay strong in the face of the storm within. After releasing the wolves, the cabin where John had lived for so many years suddenly became a hollow place, no longer filled with the hurried footsteps of the cubs running around, nor the soft growls and joyful howls when they found something interesting. Instead, it was silent and heavy with sorrow. The old walls and the house were no longer a refuge for creatures seeking protection. They were free now, and he had to face the truth that he would have to live on in that silent world. As winter approached, John began to feel a distinct change within himself. In the past, he could take pride in thinking about the wolves he had saved. But now, looking back, he could not deny that the cost of giving all his love and care was this deep emptiness. Everything had become too still, too lonely. The absence of the wolves felt like a storm, sweeping through his life and leaving behind an indelible mark. But one day, while wandering around the farm checking the usual tasks, he unexpectedly heard a strange sound. It was a small, soft noise, like a faint growl, coming from the distant woods. He paused, feeling a breeze of fresh air blow through his mind. John rushed outside, still not quite believing what he was about to witness. As he reached the forest edge, he saw something he never imagined would happen. The wolves, the ones he had released long ago, were standing there, watching him. The wolves did not keep their distance, but came closer, their sharp eyes no longer filled with confusion or fear. They had matured, grown strong, and clearly they had not forgotten him. John stood there, silent, just looking at them. In that moment, he felt as though he had been reborn. The presence of the wolves was not just the return of the creatures he had saved. It was a reaffirmation that the bond of friendship he had created between himself and them would never be broken, no matter how the world changed. The wolves no longer circled around him as they once did, but they did not leave either. They stood there, close by, their eyes full of understanding and affection. John felt an odd warmth fill his heart. This was not just salvation. It was a waking, a rebirth within his soul. The cubs, though they had returned to nature, had not forgotten him, and now they were giving him a strength he had never realized. This was the unbreakable connection between humans and nature, between John and the creatures he had cared for. With each passing day, the bond between John and the wolves grew more apparent. They no longer relied on him for material needs, but they had become an inseparable part of his life. Whenever he felt weary, whenever he was downhearted, the wolves would appear beside him, quietly sitting next to him like loyal companions. And every time, John felt the unseen comfort they brought. They did not speak, did not offer words of reassurance, but their presence was enough to make him feel that he was no longer alone. So, each morning when he woke up, there were no longer the cubs curling up in the corner of the house, but he realized that the wolves, even though they had returned to nature, still existed beside him, in the quiet moments and the encounters filled with connections only such wild creatures could bring. The emptiness he once felt had been replaced with a firm belief in himself and in this life. He understood that, like the wolves, he too had weathered the inner storm, and now he had been reborn, living a life full of completeness and meaning. The return of the wolves was not a miracle, but rather a confirmation that all he had given, love and care, was never in vain. The wolves had not forgotten him, and their lives, no matter where they were, remained connected to his in ways he could not have imagined. This was the greatest joy and comfort he could receive after all the losses and sorrows he had endured. John no longer felt lonely. As the days passed, he had learned to live with the beautiful memories, with the joy the wolves had brought. He had survived the storm, and now in his heart, nothing was permanently lost, because the love and connection between humans and nature is something that cannot be torn apart or destroyed. And in the evenings, when he sat by the fire, looking out at the wolves playing in the forest, John knew that he had found his faith in life again, in the good things that can spread from a simple act, to care, to love, and to give. The story of John and the wolf cubs is not just a personal journey of a man overcoming loneliness, but also a profound lesson in resilience, compassion, and the relationship between humans and nature. Through every challenge, from the initial days full of anxiety and doubt when he adopted the cubs, to the moment he released them back into the wild, John gradually realized that life is not merely about existence, but about the connections between all living beings, from humans to animals, from the wild world to our civilization. Every step John took had great meaning, and every decision he made reflected deep humanitarian values, which created the true strength of the story. The first point the story emphasizes is the importance of patience and unconditional love. When John decided to take the wolf cubs into his home, he was not only acting on the instincts of a man who loved nature, but also as a father, a protector willing to dedicate himself fully to caring for these small, fragile creatures. His patience in feeding the cubs, caring for them, and even overcoming his initial fear of their wildness is a portrayal of love without expecting immediate reciprocation. Each day, no matter how difficult or tiring, he never gave up because he understood that only patience could bring results. As the wolf cubs grew and began to show signs of maturity, John realized that love and protection are not just about physical care, but also about granting freedom. The decision to release the cubs back into the wild was a significant turning point, not only in the story, but also in John's personal transformation. He came to understand that true love is not about possession or control, but about giving, allowing the creatures he cared for to live freely in the way they were meant to. Releasing the wolves was not just an act of liberating them, but also an act of freeing himself from the fear of loneliness and control. The story also touches upon another important element, which is the connection between humans and nature. John, a man who had lived in solitude and only knew the work of caring for livestock, now realized that nature was not something separate or distant, but an essential part of human life. From being merely a caretaker of the wolf cubs, John gradually became a part of that wild world. The relationship between him and the wolves was not just that of a rescuer and wild animals, but one of empathy and a deep bond, where nature was not just something to be protected by humans, but something humans needed to learn from and integrate with. Looking at the grown wolves, free and wild, John understood that life does not always follow a fixed pattern. Sometimes, growth comes from knowing when to let go, when to let things happen naturally without interference. The transformation of the cubs, from weak creatures unable to care for themselves to strong warriors of nature, mirrored a process of growth in humans. Like the wolves, we need care and teaching, but eventually there comes a time when we must stand on our own and face the world independently. And like the wolves, humans must learn to leave the past behind, to live with the choices they make, with their instincts, and with the freedom that life gives. The story of the wolves, of care and release, is also a story of recovery and healing. For John, the wolves were not just wild creatures but symbols of rebirth. They helped him realize that no matter how much loss or pain we experience, if we know how to love and give, life will always find a way to revive. This story teaches us not only how to care for wild animals, but also how to care for ourselves, how to heal the wounds in our hearts, and how to find our faith in life again. A profound message the story conveys is the immense value of relationships, not just between humans, but also between humans and nature animals. The moments of connection, whether between John and the wolves or between humans and nature, are moments to be cherished. Because it is in these relationships that we find the truth about ourselves, about the world around us, and about the lasting values we can offer each other. Looking at the end of the story, we see not only the growth of the wolves, but also the growth of John himself. He was not only the caretaker, but now he had learned the most important lesson of life: giving and freedom. What he did for the wolves, he also did for himself, giving love and care, then learning to let them go, to let them become strong, free creatures to live in the way they deserved. And in that journey, John found a part of himself he had never imagined before. This story is not just about the wolves. It is a story about compassion, the bond between humans and nature, and the resilience of every living being, whether human or animal. In this world, if we can see the value of caring, loving, and giving, then every life, whether of a wolf or a human, will have meaning and be worth cherishing.